I'm James Anderson. Welcome back to my podcast. Music is just Welcome back to Music is Just a Word, the podcast where we are on a mission to save music, but at the same time, we are questioning that music could even have a definition, or could even have any distinction whatsoever from life in general. Today's episode starts with a deeper dive into Memetics and universal Darwinism that will build off the first episode, and then we're going to end off with some comments about how these things pertain to music. There's a very interesting irony with Memetics, and I think it's an irony with at least 3 layers, each layer building off of the last. So in today's episode, we're going to deal with the first and most general layer of irony, and this is that it is fundamentally ironic to apply Darwinian principles and natural selection to humans and human culture and human behaviors. I'm not going to let this stop me from doing so, but we have to point out the irony because it's important. Darwin's name has become synonymous with the expulsion of intelligence, purpose, and foresight from the design process of life and organisms. Over the many decades since Darwin, we have continued to hone and perfect this view of evolution centered around the absence of a purposeful, intentional, foresighted, intelligent designer. Let's take a moment to think about this divine creator who, before Darwin's time, was widely believed to have created all life in 6 days. There have been many gods throughout human history. Some cultures have worshipped multiple gods, some cultures have worshipped a single god, and many of these gods are exquisite creators, designers, and especially in the cases of the monotheistic religions, you have examples of an individual creator coming up with, well, everything, all the life, complexity, and design that we see around us. Now, here's the central question that I pose to you, my fellow post-Darwinian people. In whose image did humans make these creators, these deities? Who, in all of the cosmos, is capable of intelligently designing things, creating new things, complex things, things that weren't there before the creative act? I think it should be completely uncontroversial to say it's humans. We, the humans, we are the creators in whose image we created these gods. Maybe chimps and crows and orangutans can come up with the occasional tool. Maybe dolphins can come up with cool patterns with their blowing of bubbles. But it's uniquely humans in all of the known universe who are really able to intelligently design anything. So the blaring irony in trying to apply Darwinian principles and natural selection to human behavior is that we are intelligent designers, just like the personified creator against which Darwin had to define natural selection. So now, as we turn evolutionary thinking towards our own culture, we are tasked with reintroducing things like foresight, intention, purpose, intelligent design, this time on the part of humans, into the evolutionary understanding of culture and human behavior. Culture's evolution is not the familiar, purposeless, clueless, incremental process characterizing biological evolution. And in truth, I have to admit that there is a lot of modern biological evolution that is also not so purposeless and clueless. For example, there's this thing called the Baldwin effect, named after James Mark Baldwin, where an organism's learned behaviors and choices can be seen to have an effect on the genetic makeup and the future reproductive success of the organism's descendants. The best examples of the Baldwin effect involve animals learning to do something, passing on the learned behavior to their offspring, and then after enough generations, the offspring no longer have to be taught the learned behavior because it has become instinctive. And at this point, we can say that the behavior has been integrated into the genes of the animal. So the Baldwin effect is very interesting, but it's not up to the challenge of explaining the diverse beauty and complexity and uniqueness of human culture. The whole point of the Baldwin effect is to focus on the integration of an organism's learned behaviors and the resulting shifts in its environment into that organism's genes. And we know that so much of human culture replicates, gets passed from generation to generation, and mutates and evolves, all through completely non-genetic ways. If there is a spectrum of non-genetic inheritance of learned behaviors in the animal kingdom, it seems clear that humans are on the very far end of this spectrum, where cultural transmission has shaken loose from genetic transmission and is now undergoing its own independent evolutionary trajectory. Of course, it's not a completely independent trajectory because without genes there wouldn't be humans, but as we know, humans and chimpanzees share like 96 or 98% of our genes, so we know the world of difference between humans and the other apes must be due to a difference in something other than the genes constructing our physical bodies. It's our behaviors, our culture, our choices, our creativity that make us special. So if the genes have taken a backseat role, we need to describe the unit of self-replicating information involved in this cultural, non-genetic inheritance. And thanks to the field of memetics, we have a description of such a unit called the meme. And the meme is the equivalent of a gene, but for culture instead of for biology and organisms. Richard Dawkins, the originator of memetics and inventor of the word meme, says,
"When we look at the evolution of cultural traits and at their survival value, we must be clear whose survival we are talking about. Biologists, as we have seen, are accustomed to looking for advantages at the gene level. What we have not previously considered is that a cultural trait may have evolved in the way that it has simply because it is advantageous to itself."
Daniel Dennett, in his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, elaborates, saying, "The first rule of memes, as for genes, is that replication is not necessarily for the good of anything. Replicators flourish that are good at replicating, for whatever reason." A snippet about memetics that appeared in the LA Times in 1999 says, "Memetics sees ideas as a kind of virus, sometimes propagating in spite of truth and logic. Its maxim is, beliefs that survive aren't necessarily true, rules that survive aren't necessarily fair, and rituals that survive aren't necessarily necessary. Things that survive do so because they are good at surviving."
We do not have to look for conventional biological survival values of traits like religion, music, and ritual dancing. Once the genes have provided their survival machines,
Remember, the survival machines of the genes are organisms like you and me.
With brains that are capable of rapid imitation, the memes will automatically take over. We do not even have to posit a genetic advantage in imitation. All that is necessary is that the brain should be capable of imitation. Memes will then evolve that exploit the capability to the full.
Anybody listening to this who has experience with animism might be perking up at this point. The foundations of memetics are truly aligned with animism, much like the early human religions and spiritualities that involved recognizing spirits and personas in all kinds of things, from trees and rivers to mountains to storms to animals. Memetics involves recognizing maybe not spirits and personas, but certainly agency in all kinds of cultural traits. This is the agency to replicate, to persist, to not disappear. Imagine an ancient animistic person with the deeply ingrained habit of seeing personhood in non-human entities like landscapes, objects, and natural phenomena. Imagine this person transported to today's world, a world where so much of a given human's environment is made up of human behaviors and the consequences and products of those human behaviors. It's easy to imagine this ancient animistic person recognizing all kinds of struggles and triumphs and complex relationships among the many cultural traits that we have today. I could certainly see this ancient time-traveling person becoming a memeticist. What memetics really accomplishes is to show how the same kind of self-designing system that originally gave rise to life, including you and me, might emerge all over again if the conditions are right. And furthermore, this might happen despite not exactly having a purpose and not providing any benefit or advantage to any of the complexities from which it emerges. And what I'm referring to when I say that is humanity. Memetics and universal Darwinism not only give us tools for imagining what life might look like if there is life out there on another planet somewhere, but also ways to look at the different systems of complexity that are struggling to persist right here on our own planet, and to imagine what their relationships might be, and to not assume that things are always harmonious just because it all happens on the same planet. It's even possible, as Dawkins touches on in his book, that the modern replicators of today's life at one point had to usurp or take over a previous iteration of life and replication long ago. Susan Blackmore makes a similar investigation for the relationship between memes and genes, and she examines the steps leading from a state where the genes are driving the evolution of the memes to an eventual state where meme evolution is now driving gene evolution, something Blackmore calls memetic drive, and things are starting to happen that the genes would never produce by themselves. Things like the human brain growing so large that it becomes dangerous for human mothers to give birth. For me, the special thing about memetics is that it is animism at its core. As the early animistic spiritualities involved recognizing agency in the things around us, memetics involves recognizing the elements of our culture, whether inside of our brains or out, as their own beneficiaries, possibly even to the detriment of our genes and our bodies.
Nobody in this room had to design calculus or long division or alphabetization or language. We don't have to design them ourselves. And here's the really important point. Nobody has to design them, any more than anybody has to design the nightingale or the palm tree.
Instead of saying, see what humans can create through sheer original genius, the animist memeticist says, see what has created itself through humans, using humans. I think on the most general level, animism is all about relationships, and people have always had relationships, both with each other and with elements of the outside world, the non-human world, and this has always been the case. But the thing that's different about modern times is that now we have to also worry about the relationships between people and their cultural elements, such as tools and stories and VR machines. These things are not part of the natural world, but they're not human either. We also have to worry about the relationships between and among these cultural elements. As culture evolves and these intercultural relationships become more important, relationships between humans might become secondary, and this is an enormous cause for concern. So the quotes that we heard near the beginning of the episode have touched on memes that are rituals, beliefs, rules, religions, music, and ritual dancing. So now we've heard some examples of memes in this as well as the last episode. Also in the last episode, I pointed out that it's rather difficult to say something is not a meme, and that it's a bit of a slippery thing to try to define all memes across the board in a global definition. We reach a point of diminishing returns when it comes to talking about memes in general and gene equivalents, because really what we're trying to talk about is all manner of things familiar to us because they're cultural things. It's possible to waste a lot of time talking about what are memes, what are not memes, how can you be sure memes even exist? And these kinds of conversations are so unproductive because what we're really trying to talk about are things that undeniably exist, words, ideas, melodies, tools, fashions, and all other kinds of familiarly named cultural elements. So if we insist on continuing to call everything a meme instead of calling it just what it is, then we'll be falling back on abstractions and generalizations instead of what could be more particular discussions about how certain cultural traits came to be the way they are. How did the brims of hats get to be exactly shaped as they are? Okay, we're talking about hats then, not memes. How did language come to be so dominant and so central in all human endeavors? Okay, now we're talking about language, not memes. How did a single human culture practicing a specific and fundamentally unsustainable style of agriculture come to eradicate and assimilate a diversity of thousands of human cultures and livelihoods that used to thrive? Okay, then let's talk about colonization and the agricultural revolution. And this discussion might or might not involve the word memes. If music is just a word, meme is certainly just a word as well. You could potentially talk about anything and everything from a memetics standpoint. Why is music sick and dying and in danger, as Victor Wooten points out in his book, The Spirit of Music? Memetics can shed light on this issue as well. Whether a cultural trait qualifies as a meme or not really isn't a question. Whether there is evolutionary competition between alternate human endeavors and whether Darwinian principles can productively or interestingly explain the dynamics between different behavioral possibilities, these are getting closer to the questions that we want to be asking. But the real question we need to ask as memeticists is, for any particular cultural trait, are human choice, intention, and purpose being outweighed by the individual adaptations and selfishness to persist, to replicate, of the cultural trait in question? When a person is acting without purpose and foresight, acting totally impulsively, or else simply imitating others, as in the expression, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do," there is still purpose in these moments, and that is the purpose of these selfishly replicating behaviors, the purpose to persist. So as time goes on, you get all these behaviors that have built up that aren't attributable to human designers or authors, many of which are useful to us, others of which nobody can really explain. And we sometimes even get locked into very rigid social expectations that nobody is responsible for having designed, and nobody knows why, but there it is. You have to follow the rules if you don't want to stick out like a sore thumb.
Sometimes you just gotta look yourself in the mirror and say, "When in Rome."
So let's not be distracted by the terminology of memes, and let's actually just talk about the Darwinian interactions, the cooperations, the competitions between replicating elements of culture and identify them by their familiar names. Now, having said this, if we're still looking for a way to talk about these things in a very general way, I suggest using the word behavior. And I'd like to propose an experiment that we actually just replace the word meme with the word behavior. Long form would be the individual human behavior. And it's not just because the semantics suit me better. I actually can't see why meme should mean anything other than a human behavior or else the physical result of that behavior, whether that be a sound wave traveling through air or a modified piece of material or anything else. We've already experienced the sense of the word meme mutating into something obscure and almost meaningless. Why not mutate it again? This time trying to keep the concept intact and just changing the name. But even for people who have been following memetics since the very beginning, meme is still a bit of an ill-defined word, as I mentioned in the first episode. This basically means there might or might not be much of a difference between a meme and just a behavior. An explanation of memes by Daniel Dennett might be able to help us out.
A lot of people think, well, wait a minute, there's a huge disanalogy here. Genes are DNA. What's the DNA of memes? And the first thing you have to appreciate is, no, genes aren't DNA. Genes are the information carried by the DNA. Genes are no more DNA than poems are made of ink. Once you get used to thinking of genes as not DNA, but the information carried by the patterns of the nucleotides in DNA, then you can see that there really is a nice parallel. Well then, what's playing the role of DNA in the land of culture? What are the physical implementations? Well, they're wonderfully various.
And given this wonderful variety, I think it's a bit misleading to refer to all memes across the board by this one name. It doesn't seem to give justice to how different evolutionary dynamics might occur in different areas. But as varied as memes are, and as varied as culture is, there is one common thread connecting it all together, and that's humans. There are really no examples of memes that don't involve a human behavior at some point in their life cycles. Even if the only human involvement is to experience it, this is what gives any cultural trait meaning. If memes are really information, as Dennett says, this gives us permission to look for the formations of memes in different ways as we see fit. Any cultural replicator goes through different phases, sometimes being embedded in our neural structures in the brain, other times being embedded in the sound waves as we speak to each other. Cultural replicators can also appear as the materials that people work with and assemble, tools and art and that kind of stuff. For me, memes being information means that no one of these phases in the cycles of replication is any more important than any other phase, or any better qualified to represent the whole spectrum of cultural copying and heredity. On a more practical level, we can't really express a meme except through behavior. So, why not just consider the behaviors themselves to be the replicators? Human behaviors and communications happen to be the most significant things in the whole universe, now more than ever before, so I'm not sure why we would frame our investigation in any other terms than those. life has so many different levels of organization, from the minuscule level of genes up to the small level of individual organisms, and then all the way up to great groups of organisms and entire species, and eventually up to entire ecosystems. Evolutionary competition happens at different levels in this hierarchy of life. Over the years, biologists have often debated on what level in this hierarchy does natural selection really operate. In Richard Dawkins' books, The Selfish Gene and The Extended Phenotype, he argues that natural selection really operates at the level of the individual genes. According to Dawkins, considering groups of organisms to be in evolutionary competition with each other is often a fallacy and leads to incorrect predictions. Much of Dawkins' importance to biology is that he exposed the flawed reasoning when people suggest that animals other than humans make sacrifices for the good of the group or for the good of the species. Organisms don't really evolve in a species-oriented way, for example, limiting their own reproductive success to avoid overpopulation, because if there was a mutation and a selfish individual arose, one that didn't limit its own reproductive success for the sake of the species, then this individual would reproduce more abundantly, and this lack of self-sacrifice, this lack of regard for the group or species, would spread all through the gene pool until eventually the whole species is as selfish as that one mutant individual. So this is a clear illustration of how, if we're looking for the unit that nature selects or rejects in natural selection, and if we set our sights too large, in other words, if we look too high on the hierarchy of life, we risk misunderstanding the mechanics of evolution. Moving over into the world of culture, much of the same thinking applies. A festival might run every year, but a whole festival couldn't be a replicator. I mean, each one's different. By contrast, the individual behaviors and communications combining in their millions to form the festival are certainly replicating, and doing so very precisely. Of course, just because we have a wonderful analogy between genes and memes doesn't mean that everything in biology is going to metaphorically translate to something in the evolution of human culture, but we can take steps to make sure that our concepts are properly nested within each other, and that we are looking for replication on the correct levels of organization. Although in the world of culture, we don't have that same division between replicator and vehicle, the world of biology makes the strong suggestion that we regard the smaller levels of organization and the smaller patterns as the things that are most invariably, most mechanically, and to use Dawkins' terminology, the most selfishly replicating. I suggest that the safest bet will usually be to view evolutionary competition from the bottom up, from the small levels of individual behaviors and communications, cascading up to the big levels of whole categories of things. The great top-level structures of human behavior and human culture, things like markets, religions, nations, these great lumbering federations of meme, all co-adapted to help each other's replication, these things all boil down to individual human relationships, individual interactions, and individual human behaviors and communications. For example, you could say that a colonial culture is in evolutionary competition against an indigenous culture. But this competition can only play out one moment at a time, one behavior at a time, and often with blurry boundaries, many individual behaviors not decisively fitting into one category or the other. Someone viewing things from the top down, in other words, from the greater levels of organization, might comment on a political climate involving tension between races of people, but the bottom-up memeticist, focusing on the genes of culture, will tell you that if there's tension between ethnicities or otherwise groups of people, this boils down to nothing other than tension in between individuals. Another example, whether a society is matriarchal or patriarchal comes down to the way individuals interact with each other. And there might be some clear matriarchies out there, and there might be some clear patriarchies. But I suspect much more common than this, and this is definitely the case in my homeland of Canada, matriarchy and patriarchy coexist in a fuzzy and ambiguous overlap, and which one prevails at any given moment comes down to the way individuals act in certain moments. Whether this is a man's world or a woman's world can change in the time that it takes one person to make one communication. And here's my last example before I get back into music. It's quite common to hear sweeping criticisms of capitalism as a system in general. Well, whether capitalism is thriving or not, and whether or not markets and trade as ways for humans to interface with each other are thriving and enjoying evolutionary success, This boils down to nothing other than individual people seizing individual opportunities to engage in trade and commerce and to turn things into commodities and products in place of, say, a tribal system of mutual support and protection. So if someone makes a comment in the top-down way that a certain region or certain activity or country is embodying capitalism or capitalistic values, this is really just a great sweeping summary of millions or billions or trillions of specific interactions and specific choices made by specific individual people. So in line with the great top-level structures I just mentioned, nations, markets, religions, and perhaps genres and styles and so on, let's take a great sweeping category like the music industry. And of course, as easy and quick as it is for me to say the music industry, we all know this is a far-reaching group of behaviors, probably including trillions of individual behaviors and communications. And so the burden is on us as memeticists to look at this bottom level of individual behaviors and ask what behaviors comprising the music industry and music in general are managing to replicate, to be adapted, and to achieve evolutionary success, and what behaviors are being outcompeted and therefore not managing to replicate, or else replicating in a modified or limited capacity. If we look at all of music as a great interconnected group of behavioral information, and we suppose that all the replicators therein are evolutionarily adapted to assist each other's replication and to generally function for the good of the group that is music, then you certainly wouldn't be surprised to look into the music industry and see a whole host of music industry behaviors that are themselves not music at all, and a whole host of gatherings and conversations and interactions that people conduct in the name of music in one way or another, but that actually entail very little music and sometimes no music at all. Very frequently, I've seen music become all about anything and everything other than the actual music. It becomes about the membership of a group, who is in versus out of the band. I've seen it become about the name, the brand, the marketing, the promotion, the money, the color palette, the big stage performance, all about the production, all about the post-production, all about the recording. It becomes all about the gathering of promo footage. It becomes all about the music video, the announcements, the reviews. I've seen it become all about the politics, all about the education, the curriculum, the tutorials. It becomes all about the awards, all about the tools, the subscriptions, the cryptocurrencies and NFTs, the big wall of subwoofers, the authorship, the ownership, the sponsorship, the clout, the rights. It becomes all about the networking, the schmoozing, the gossip, and so on and so on. And this might not be very concerning for someone who views music as an overall group comprised of mutually assisting, mutually reinforcing parts. Might not be very concerning for you if you look at the evolution of music, and music does evolve, this cannot be doubted. But if you consider the different parts of music culture to be evolving towards outcomes that are good for the group, evolving in a way that is oriented towards the group that is music, if this is your understanding of cultural evolution, then you might not be concerned about the staggering amount of non-musical participation in music culture. However, as memeticists and as viewers of evolutionary competition from the bottom up, focusing on individual behaviors, we are very concerned that so many of the behaviors comprising the music industry and music in general are not actual musical communications. So many of these behaviors are loosely music-oriented and are somewhat music-serving. At least they appear to be, but they themselves, on the individual level, on the genetic level of cultural evolution, are probably really competing against the actual musical behaviors. They are competing for a limited supply of human brain power, and they are competing for the limited time of day which we have to devote to them. Intuition may suggest that these communications peripheral to the music would be serving the music, but ultimately they are communications alongside the music, alternate to the music. So, from a Darwinian perspective, we can consider them competitors to music. And this competition plays out in many ways, some very direct and some very subtle and indirect. For an example of more direct competition, I'm thinking of times I've showed up to music festivals, I'm trying to enjoy one of the acts that's on stage presently, and someone is pushing a piece of paper at me for me to sign regarding my upcoming performance. Another example, times when I've been playing a solo and somebody in the jam is offering live play-by-play commentary about the solo, such that I can hardly even concentrate on the music that's coming out of me, because it's all being named in real time. Even if you have none of this industry experience, in other words, even if you're just a music listener, this idea should probably be somewhat familiar to you. The idea of non-musical communications determining the outcomes of music more than the musical communications. How much of the music that gets the playing time or makes its way onto your playlist is able to do so because of the music itself? And conversely, how much of the music that reaches our ears has done so because of the sex appeal or the notoriety of the artist, or because the artist is so cool, or because you share a common cause with the artist, or perhaps because there's an intriguing or shady story? It's absolutely no secret that there is a lot of drama with music, and a lot of the action and engagement around music and music culture is driven by kind of the more tabloid side of things. The stories about bandmates bickering and falling out and hooking up and doing all those things that people do. Projects often get to the point where the musical behaviors begin to lose and the drama starts to win. So these have been a few examples of evolutionary competition on a more direct level, individual behavior against individual behavior. On a more indirect and subtle level, we see competition playing out gradually, and so over time, it starts to seem more viable for a musician to produce a product review or a tutorial than to actually release some music, or better yet, to actually show up in person and play some music. It's pretty well known that many of these ways of being peripherally involved in music are the more feasible routes from a standpoint of making a living. The actual musicians that are making the content that it's all about are often the grunts of the industry, the people at the bottom of the totem pole. A very lucky few manage to make it big, and this provides incentive for musicians to continue making the gamble to actually be the content creators that it all hinges around. But by and large, the peripheral positions in the music industry are much less of a gamble as far as working and earning a living. And for people who are not only musicians but also peripherally involved, it's the peripheral involvement that often earns us our income, and the actual music making that is the side project. How many people can you think of that are a tech or a teacher as a career, for example, and have music projects as hobbies? In my 10 years or so working as a musician, there have been countless times when, instead of replicating one of the actual musical gestures, to sing or to strike an instrument or to begin a groove or a song or to start dancing, a person will find it more attractive or more feasible or more conducive to their own social standing to replicate one of the behaviors of a person that serves music from the outside as a non-musician. I've seen a lot of people band leading when they could have just been playing music. I've seen a lot of people planning and organizing upcoming music when they could have just been playing music. I've seen people going on about awards that they won or that they're going to win instead of just playing music. I've seen plenty of people enacting social agendas, advocating for someone who they think ought to be getting playing time, or sternly instructing people regarding their treatment of an instrument instead of just worrying about their own contribution to the music. I've seen a lot of people educating about music, engaging in the politics of music, engaging in the production of music, and otherwise talking about music when they could have just been making music. And as many times as I've had this grievance against other people, you better believe I've been the problem myself. Many times I've shown up to an event or a gathering, and seemingly in imitation of a larger event that would normally involve many special positions and jobs surrounding the music, people seem to be contributing to the music in any and every way other than to just join in. So as our bottom-up, individual behavior-focused approach reveals, even when music is being celebrated, even when music is all the rage, there are times when music is almost nowhere to be found. As As we look to memetics and evolutionary theory to help us diagnose the sickness of music, the most general thing to note is that, from the point of view of a cultural trait, persistence through replication is a very competitive enterprise. Intuitively, we know that there are far too many individual behaviors, as well as the consequences and products of these behaviors, for all of them to have widespread success. So naturally, in the course of time, the patterns in our behavior that seem the keenest to persist and are the best adapted for persisting and replicating will grow to outnumber the ones that don't have these qualities. Irrespective of human intention and human purpose, the best adapted behaviors will tend to replicate at the expense of behaviors that are worse adapted. So we have to ask, with the languages and techniques and otherwise cultural traits that are doing well today, what qualities did they have in order to replicate successfully? And what other behaviors paid the price? There is a limited overall bandwidth for all human communication. If one family of communications increases in prevalence, it means less of something else. So if we are becoming aware that musical behaviors are failing to replicate, we could either go on the defensive and try to foster the growth and the replication of the musical behaviors we hold dear, or we could go on the offensive and try to seek out what behaviors alternate to music are primarily responsible for challenging music. Now, whether we go on the defensive or the offensive, it's important to remember that these are individual human behaviors that we are attacking or defending, not the humans making them. Memetics and universal Darwinism give us a perspective where we can look outside of human purpose and intentions, and particularly for the unpleasant things, memetics suggests that we look beyond any ill intent on the part of humans. This perspective involves seeing people somewhat as passive conduits or channelers to these fundamental units of cultural information that ultimately have their own life and their own existence to maintain. When considering the wonderful, creative, genius human acts in history, viewing things in this way might seem like a demotion. It might seem like humans aren't that special anymore. But as we all know, we have reached a very dismal and very hazardous point in the history of human culture. Thanks to civilization, humans are causing a mass extinction event, which might also be our own undoing. Much of the human world is starving, and of the parts of the human world that are comfortably fed, many people suffer from a severe social poverty, an impoverishment of human connection. We seem to live in an era where alienation, addiction, and all kinds of mental illnesses abound. Memetics and evolutionary theory remind us that nobody really designed this particular state of the world. It just arrived, one incremental little step at a time. I think the reason I got drawn into memetics in the first place is that memetics provides a framework for excluding individual behaviors rather than excluding individual people. Probably everyone listening to this knows somebody who is perpetually over certain kinds of people. Someone who's always having the revelation that they are done with various personality types. I'm not done with anybody. Having to deal with people and their problems is becoming ever more inescapable. As memeticists, it's behavioral patterns that we are exposing and attempting to abolish in an effort to salvage the relationships with the people that make these behaviors. As we seek out the individual behaviors that we are threatened by, that we object to, that we are trying to rid the world of, particularly the ones that threaten music, we have to remember there is no hard and fast definition of what music is and what music isn't. And so a lot of these human behaviors and cultural traits that are potentially going to be our undoing might very well constitute music in somebody's definition of music. We don't really know. There might even be as many definitions of music as there are people to define it. 'Cause at the end of the day, music is just a word. Thanks for tuning in to Music is Just a Word, Episode 2. I'm James Anderson. Music by me, damn it. And thanks to Q Mike McGee for screaming the title. Stay tuned for Episode 3.